Hello and welcome to Tekpub's Mastering ASP.NET 4. This is Craig Shoemaker. Now this series was made especially with you, the professional developer, in mind, in order to give you a quick start into learning all of the new features and functionality of ASP.NET 4. Now I've got all the details for you, but before I get started, I wanted to go over a little bit of history. ASP.NET 1 and 1.1 were quite a departure from the existing Microsoft stack at the time when it first came out. Classic ASP, being known really for its scripting nature, would commingle together your logic with your markup. And with the advent of ASP.NET, you were able to package all of your logic into a single DLL. Now, this was also built on top of the .NET framework, so it also introduced some very formal object orientation practices into web development. And that really gave way to the page and control architecture that we find today within ASP.NET. And it's this architecture that really gives the benefits found in the framework. So this was the 1.0 release. It was just getting everything ready. You had all the basic controls. And the 1.1 release added in some mobile controls and some validation controls. So the latest advent of ASP.NET, ASP.NET 4, solves many of the problems and many of the pain points that people found with the earlier versions of the framework. You have full control over the client IDs that are generated. There's a new project template that helps get things going. There's a number of different view state optimizations where it gives you control over the view state, and it's turned off on controls and pages by default. There are SEO improvements that help with markup and also creating the structure of your page, and web config optimizations. Now again, this is just a little bit of some of the changes, but this should give you a general idea of where the framework's come and where it's headed. Now that you got a feel for the new project template that's found in ASP.NET 4, let's start dealing with the web config a little bit. And I would like to show you how to do some transformations so that you can have different settings in your debug, staging, and production environments. To begin, let's take a look at this web config. That's basically the same thing that comes out of the default project template. I've just moved some of the extra code down so that what's in our window here is just what we're dealing with. So if you'll notice here, I have a connection string and it has the name of my DB, and the connection string is empty, and I've got my provider name as I would want for my SQL client. But if I come up here to build and I say publish ASP.NET demo, I can move this down, and something that I want to do is just copy this to the file system right now. So we're just publishing it to the file system. And I'll rename this profile right now to file system. And I have a location here that I've set aside. That's the deployment area for the application. And I'll just say delete existing, so as we go through here, we'll only have the freshest stuff. Now, let's look at the build configuration here. We're pointing to the release build configuration. So when I hit publish, it's going to spin through a couple things, and now I can bring up the files that were generated as part of that build. So when I take a look at the web config, now you can see that it says release SQL Server because I did it based off of the release build. But if I switch this over to debug and switch over to a file in my application now and say publish demo again, it'll say that that web config has been changed. And because I'm pointing to debug, now you can see that it has debug SQL Server. So in this section, I'm going to show you a number of different ways that you can create different manipulations of the web config based off of the different type of build profiles. So now that you see the goal, let me take you step by step through the syntax so you can see how it's done. If we take a look at Solution Explorer, you'll see that we have a web config here. And now with ASP.NET 4, we have a little expansion icon, and you can see that underneath we have these other config files. We have the web.debug config and the web.release config. Now these aren't the only options available to you. You could come up to the build menu here and choose Configuration Manager. And then what we could do is create a new one, and we'll call this Staging. And we'll copy settings from debug, let's say. And then we want to say create new project configurations. When we click OK and click Close, now we can right-click on the web config and say Add Config Transforms, and that will bring in our staging. So any type of environment your application finds it's in, the framework is flexible enough in order to give you a transformation that will fit that one. So let's take a look at the web config itself. Now, I've kind of cleaned this up a little bit, and again, the rest of the code is down at the bottom, but I'm just putting into view what's relevant for our talk right now. And I've created some app settings, and right now I'm just going to keep things really generic. So I'm just saying application key 0, 1, 2, on and on. But I want you to see here that within the web config, the value is default value. And you'll see how this value will change through the different manipulations that we do. So let's take a look at the debug config here for a moment and see how we can begin to interact with the web config file. So at the very top, you'll see there's an XML namespace of XDT declared. And this gives us the document transform capabilities that are needed just for the web config. So let's start off by just doing a transformation. And if we do XDT : transform and to give it the command of remove, when we build this application, we can remove out the application key of 0. So let's do that. Let's make sure we're looking at the debug profile and publish it to the file system. And remember, our web config as it existed here had the application key of 0 and application key of 1. And so now when we take a look at the web config, you can see that 0 is removed from our web config. Now what's happening here is you have a couple different ways that you can interact with the items that show up in the web config. You can transform it, and the transform gives you a number of different types of transforms that you can do. The next one we'll take a look at is replace. So this time, instead of saying remove, what I'll do, I'm going to slide this over. So this is the generated one, this is the real one, and this is our transform. So we'll replace the item that's in the web config here. So instead of saying the value is default value, we'll call this debug value. So it'll take what's in the transform file here and replace it with what's found in the real web config and write it out to the generated one here. So let's build this once again. So now that it's changed, we can come in here and you can see that this one now has the debug value. Now, what if you want to put a new key in the web config? Let's call this application key 2, and we'll do the transform of insert. Let's build it once again. And now when we take a look at it, we have 0, 1, and 2. So we took out the replace here, so this has its default value again, and then we have the debug value coming from our insert in the debug config or transform file.